June 12, 1943. Over the western reaches of the Solomon Islands, at 27,000 feet, a small dark shape broke the horizon and moved like a stubborn whale through a cobalt sea. The oxygen mask smelled of metal and tobacco, and Lieutenant James Calloway felt the chill of thin air press at his throat as he squinted through frost on the canopy and watched the newcomer climb with a steady, unapologetic lumber. For pilots bred on nimble turns and razor-edge dives, the shape was almost an insult. The inverted gull wing cutting a silhouette that refused to look elegant, the long nose and thick fuselage more truck than thoroughbred. Voices in the formation radio were flat with derision, then laughter. What is that thing? A bathtub with wings. Look at those ugly gull wings. And for a moment, the scorn felt like company. Then tracers knitted the sky, and the mockery died. The machine ahead carried the sound of a heavy radial engine in a register that made other fighters sound thin. It carried weight and armor and a stomach full of ammunition. It carried a calculation of attrition that would rewrite how naval air power fought in the Pacific. This is the story of how they mocked the F4U Corsair until its wings painted the Pacific skies red, and how an aircraft born of compromise and stubborn engineering forced tactics to bend around production, endurance, and concentrated firepower. The opening image is precise, the sea like polished steel, the date on a filed mission log, and a pilot with a cigarette still warm between his fingers. The sensory detail meant to drop the listener into a cockpit the way a camera drops into the eye of a storm. The promise is simple and dramatic. What began as ridicule would become dread, and the numbers would tell why the laughter ended. The Pratt Whitney R2800 radio producing roughly 2,000 horsepower. The fuselage designed to take punishment. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns standard in early variants, a top speed approaching 446 miles per hour, and a combat radius measured in hundreds of miles. All ahead of doctrine that expected delicate dogfighting rather than weighty survivability. In weeks, the tactics taught in flight schools would be revised, not for grace, but for endurance. Not for fleeting kills, but for the ability to show up day after day and turn the enemy's logistics into ash. How did a plane that looked like a clumsy sea beast come to own the Pacific skies? How did mockery turn into massacre? The need that birthed the Corsair was strategic and urgent. Naval aviators and fleet thinkers demanded a platform with speed and climb to intercept enemy bombers and the ability to survive the brutal environment of carrier operations and long overwater regions. Designers at the Naval Bureau and at the Goodyear and Vought facilities received specifications that read like a military wish list. High horsepower, compact frontal area, carrier usable, and sufficiently rugged to carry heavy armament. Chief Engineer Rex Beach asked for a powerful engine that would sit low in the fuselage and be harnessed by a carefully designed wing. The inverted gull wing solved a production problem. It allowed short landing gear to clear a massive propeller while keeping the engine low enough to preserve a tight profile. In design rooms, the men smoked and argued. The math was crude and honest. Horsepower weighed in the ledger like grain in a wartime market. The R2800 had twin-row cylinders and a turbo supercharger that chewed altitude and spit it out in a steady hand. The radio provided torque and reliability in theater and allowed easier field maintenance compared with liquid-cooled V engines. The philosophy was industrial first, muscle over ballet. The plane had to be produced fast, kept flying, and repaired cheaply, a doctrine that privileged availability over perfection. Vought design notes showed trade-offs. The fuselage would be thick to absorb damage, the canopy tall to give pilots the visibility demanded for carrier landings, and the armament heavy to make each sortie an acre of steel and fire. Franklin Hayes, the factory manager in Connecticut, would later say, "We were not building poetry, we were building something that could take a beating and give a beating back." The language of a war economy, translating sketches into production lines into a raw, relentless capacity to outlast the enemy. The early specs included a wing area large enough to carry drop tanks, accepted because range mattered more than stealth, and a landing gear robust because landing on pitching carriers is a brutal arithmetic. It was not elegance, it was utility, and the men who signed the papers knew utility wins wars. Prototype testing began in the late spring, and the first flights exposed the aircraft to the merciless teacher that is air and time. Test pilot Captain Aldo Ruiz climbed into the cockpit and felt the vibration of a machine with attitude. The controls heavy at first as the pilot learned to tame the torque. The plane could pitch and pull, but its behavior at low speed was tricky, a trait that earned it the early nickname among pilots, the bird that hates you back. On one test, a stubborn stall occurred at a landing approach, and the aircraft nosed over hard. The canopy scraped deck paint, and the landing gear folded in a shower of sparks. The accident investigation recorded spinning tendencies in certain configurations, control harmonization issues, and the need for improved pilot training, specifically for carrier approaches. Captain Ruiz reported that the sound during the engine spool felt like someone cranking a ship out of a dock. The smell of hot oil and heated metal clung to his flight suit for hours after the test, and mechanics found hairline cracks in a gear assembly. They tightened bolts, replaced struts, and adjusted the cowl flaps. The machine learned its own limitations in the hands of men who would later teach pilots how to live with them. The attrition of prototypes was not simply mechanical, it cost lives. Several test pilots and early instructors were injured or killed. The official log recorded losses with cold numbers, but the hangar filled with grief and the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke and late nights as teams rebalanced components and reworked training syllabi. Lieutenant James Calloway would later remember these days as a crucible, the sound of alarms, an ever-present sense of improvisation, and the knowledge that every change could be the difference between a safe return and a stretch of canvas on a table at a hospital. The early incidents hardened resolve and fed a learning loop that would be vital once the Corsair reached combat theaters. When the Corsair first appeared before enemy pilots, the reaction was mockery, then miscalculation. Japanese pilots who had perfected nimble zeros saw the Corsair as slow and ungainly, ridiculed as a cumbersome interceptor. The formation radios in early Pacific sorties echoed disbelief. They sent that bucket? How do we even dogfight that thing? The initial engagements confirmed misjudgment. In part, the Corsair was not a graceful dancer. It was a heavyweight with the heart of a prizefighter and the lungs of a long-distance runner. The first significant encounters revealed its brutal advantages on energy fighting. It could climb out of a furball using its powerful engine, sprinting to altitude, and then dive with a surge of speed that its adversaries could not match. Boom and zoom became not a catchphrase, but doctrine. Pilots learned to trade turning contests for vertical movement to exploit the Corsair's horsepower and the convergence of heavy machine guns that delivered an avalanche of lead. In a combat report, the commander of a carrier air wing, Admiral Richard Lawson, wrote that the aircraft was not the prettiest tool in the box, but it was proving to be a very effective blunt instrument. Early tallies showed kills and losses that surprised both sides. The Corsair could absorb damage and still put its pilot home. The armored seat and self-sealing fuel tanks meant pilots who would have been lost in lighter fighters sometimes returned with half their plane missing. The psychological effect was swift. For the first time in several campaigns, the Japanese recognized an enemy plane that could trade shots and win on sustained exchanges. This recognition did not come without cost. Many Corsairs were lost to inexperienced carrier landings. Initially, the aircraft was kept ashore, where Navy Bureau tried to tame it for carrier operations from airfields. And the Marine Corps took many of the early squadrons to island bases, where the Corsair could be a potent land-based fighter-bomber. One incident that became a turning point in how people spoke of the Corsair was recorded on a humid afternoon over Bougainville. A mission that began as routine supply interdiction turned into an endurance trial. Lieutenant Calloway and his wingman Earl Muldoon spotted a convoy hugging
a reef. The air smelled of diesel and salt as they lined up for the attack. Calloway's radio crackled. "Red, are you set?" "Set and steady," Muldoon answered, his voice high with adrenaline. The first pass drew flak, heavy and accurate. One of the Corsairs took a hit in the tail control surfaces. The air shook. The taste of copper filled Calloway's mouth as metal bit into fabric. Engines coughed and the left wing flickered. A misaligned flap sent oscillations through the controls. Calloway radioed, "I am hit. Can you hold?" Muldoon pushed, "Hold for now. Brake left if you have to." Memories from training flashed in Calloway's head. The warm porch of his childhood, watching biplanes loop the sky. The smell of his mother's kitchen. The day he lost his brother in a river when he was young. And the promise he whispered to himself before flight, that he would come back. He turned the nose down, dropped speed to stabilize, and found that despite the injury, the aircraft kept flying. The radio refused to die. The instruments showed fuel still feeding the engine. The gauges held at the margins of green. A second burst of anti-aircraft fire punched through the canopy. Shrapnel kissed his right arm, and he heard the tinny voice of Muldoon again. "Jimmy, you are leaking oil. You can't make the carrier." Calloway's hands were a map of small cuts, but steady. "I am going for the reef strip. I see a flat patch." The descent was a collection of exacting adjustments, a slow and painful choreography. The ground rushed up, and then his wheels met coral and sand. The landing gear held for one frantic second and collapsed, but the airframe slid on through a prickly wash of waves, and silence followed. The machine breathed and spat steam. The crew that ran out to meet him saw an aircraft maimed and a pilot bleeding, but alive and coherent. A miracle in the logic of armored seats and rugged engines. Calloway walked away from a plane that looked as if it had been through a meat grinder, and his face was a study of astonished survival. The official after-action report would later compress this incident into numbers, but the men on the island told it like a legend. The Corsair had refused to die, and in doing so had proven a hypothesis that engineers had been arguing since the first bitter tests. Adapting tactics around the Corsair required commanders and pilots to rethink engagements and training syllabi that had been honed against lighter fighters. The basic lesson was to avoid being lured into horizontal turning fights where weight and wing loading punished the Corsair, and instead to use its climb and energy retention to control the engagement. Gunnery instructor Beauregard Klein taught pilots how to exploit the convergence of 4 to 6 machine guns, depending on variant, to deliver concentrated bursts at short range. A tactics class involved a practical sequence: approach, high maintain energy, target deflection, 5 degrees, aim slightly low, fire 2-second burst, then break up and climb. The language was technical but simple because in combat there is no time for poetry. Naval Intelligence, Samuel Price, pushed for standardized ammo loads and recommended an increase in ammunition per wing station to sustain longer engagements. He argued that the combination of rate of fire and weight of bullets mattered more than who won a single dogfight. In carrier conferences, commanders talked about aircraft availability and the economics of sorties. The Corsair demanded a different sort of logistics, more robust spare part stockpiles, and more mechanics trained in radial engines. The effect on training was measurable. Training hours shifted away from acrobatics toward energy management. Simulated carrier approaches multiplied, and instructors worked on standardizing landing techniques to reduce attrition. Dialogue among squadron leaders became practical and blunt. You will not try to beat a zero at turning. You will climb, use your speed, and deliver fire. The argument was a pivot away from an idealized form of fighter combat toward an industrialized application of force, where return rates and sortie counts mattered as much as individual skill. One of the greatest demonstrations of the Corsair's potential happened on a dawn mission targeting a Japanese supply convoy threading between islands. The sky was a low-lit bowl of cloud, and the smell of wet foliage rose up as the fighters buzzed toward the objective. This raid was organized with multiple squadrons and aimed to break a supply chain that had kept an island garrison alive for months. The flight leader, Captain Harrington, briefed the men with precise timing and numbers. "We fly at 10,000, rendezvous at Point Alpha, approach heading 090, engage for 5 minutes on each pass, maintain separation 2 miles. The first pass saw suppression of anti-aircraft batteries by fighters that strafed gun emplacements. The Corsair proved less useful at dogfighting, but devastating when used as a strafing and interdiction platform. Pockets of smoke and burning fuel marked the convoy. The sound of machine guns created a new kind of thunder in the islands. Reports after the mission cataloged destruction. The convoy suffered heavy damage, estimated 30% of transport capacity lost, several ammunition dumps ignited, and the psychological effect on enemy movement was immediate. The numbers looked different in the logbooks than in the stories, but both mattered. The plane had become a weapon against logistics and not only a platform for aces to try for glory. Journalists who later visited the area described sailors and soldiers talking about a new kind of aerial terror, an aircraft that did not come for a single duel, but for the steady erosion of supply. The raid changed how island commanders moved their columns, and the ripple would be felt in supply delays and increased vulnerability of outposts. Production and logistics turned this aircraft from prototype to strategic instrument. Factories in Farmingdale and other locations ramped up to provide parts and assemble airframes. The industrial story is not glamorous. It is the hum of presses, the smell of hot metal, the orchestration of thousands of workers moving in a cadence measured in shift changes and crate counts. Franklin Hayes maintained a ledger that read like a war poem. Numbers of engines per week, crates of propellers, bolts, and rivets. The workforce swelled with former car mechanics, machinists, and women who learned to rivet and wield pneumatic tools. Units of the Navy and Marine Corps received training, modifications, and spares depots. Grew into logistics hubs. The rate of production meant that aircraft losses could be replaced and that the sustained pressure on enemy supply lines could continue. The manufacturing scale created a strategic advantage. The enemy could not match in the same tempo and with the same redundancy. Each new aircraft that rolled off a line into a carrier group or island airfield increased the density of firepower available to commanders and forced adaptations in enemy tactics. The Corsair became an axis around which industrial capacity and military necessity turned. A symbol of how production could translate into presence and not simply superiority in a single engagement. The human texture of this story is carried by a cast of named figures who populate hangars and command rooms and oil-streaked ramps. Lieutenant James Calloway, the protagonist, a pilot with a tenuous sense of humor and an aversion to ceremony, came from a small Ohio town where his father worked a coal line and his mother taught Latin. His backstory began in a farmhouse with a radio always tuned to transmissions about distant wars, and with a childhood of building rudimentary models of biplanes from wood and wax. The smell of sawdust a constant companion. In adolescence, he earned a scholarship to a university engineering program, then left to join an aviation mechanic corps before becoming a pilot. He carried with him a memory of loss, the death of his younger brother in a river accident, a grief that sensibly oriented him to protect others and to focus on survivability and practicalities. Training hardened him, and institutional failures taught impatient lessons he had to repeat twice and then teach fellow pilots. Presently, he was a lieutenant with a scar across his eyebrow, a thin line that would appear in pictures later as the mark of someone who had been close to catastrophe and lived. Calloway's personality informed tactics. He favored direct approaches and precision in gunnery. He trusted machines and men who could be counted on, not those who sought glory. Secondary characters included wingman Earl Muldoon, called Red for his hair, who favored quick wit and rapid action. Commander Harold Vance, a meticulous officer in charge of mission planning, who rationed risk and spells of downtime. Chief Mechanic Tomika Sato, who fixed engines in 15 minutes that paperwork insisted took hours. Civilian Factory Manager Franklin Hayes, who balanced quotas and morale. gunnery instructor Beauregard Klein, who preferred
the mathematics of convergence to metaphors, and naval intelligence officer Samuel Price, who tracked enemy logistic movements. Test pilot Captain Aldo Ruiz, who taught purple-faced novices how to coax the plane into safe carrier landings. And Admiral Richard Lawson, who viewed the theater from a map and a ledger. Each character acted with specificity on the field. Muldoon once jammed a gun mid-assault and screamed to Calloway, "You have to keep on him." And Calloway replied, "I will burn his fuel if I have to." The exchange, quick and raw, and later around a campfire, they argued strategy and swore about loss. Each of these figures pushed procedures, pilots, ground crews, administrators, and sailors, aligning a network of action that made the Corsair effective beyond its metal. Tension built in sequences that tested both machine and spirit, and these moments were heavy and intimate. One critical episode came during a night takeoff where the carrier deck was slick and low cloud obscured the horizon. Calloway felt vertigo as the carrier lurched under him and the engine howled. The plane responded in fits and started to yaw violently. He heard a machine voice on deck, "Abort," and his hands moved in a rehearsal of training. Something in him wanted to climb away and try again. A memory of his brother's laugh like a phantom pressed in his skull. The choice to push or pull creased his face. He chose to commit, to trust the aircraft and the mechanics. The landing became a test of nerve. The Corsair bit the deck with weight and shook as securing ropes took strain. The sense of imminent failure compressed time into a tight glass tube, and then release came, a small applause on deck. Another moment of tension was a low-altitude rescue over reef and oil, where Calloway had to circle and provide cover for a downed pilot. The sensory overload was complete. Salt stung in the nose, the sun flashed off water. The radio static carried the voice of the downed man breaking in fear. Calloway spoke calmly and then violently as tactical needs demanded. The pilot in the water was hauled aboard by a boat, and Calloway felt every shudder of relief as if it were a personal wound healed. These sequences were not cinematic flourishes alone. They altered crew morale and confirmed that survivability, combined with skill, produces stories that stick to the bones. Technical description of a key procedure is necessary to understand why certain maneuvers worked. Carrier landing technique evolved with the Corsair. Pilots were taught to approach at a slightly higher angle of attack and to use throttle modulation to control sink rate, as the wide propeller and torque could cause sudden deviations on final approach. The landing procedure emphasized stabilizing on the glide slope, trimming the rudder to counter torque, and flaring at a specific cadence to bleed speed without inducing a stall. Mechanics checked landing gear tolerances and reinforced struts, and pilots learned to expect a stiff touchdown. These practical steps required repeated drills and precise maintenance rituals. The procedure compressed into 3 main steps: trim and stabilize, manage throttle angle, attack, flare, and lock down wheels. The clear explanation helped reduce carrier losses and allowed the Corsair to join carrier air wings in greater numbers. Around 1/3 into the narrative, there is a moment of pause intended to solicit comment and community engagement. If you were surprised by the resilience shown in the incident you just heard, you are not alone. Many pilots and crews were stunned by how often men and machines came back from what should have been fatal damage. Which detail surprised you most? The aircraft resilience, the pilot skill, or the scale of production? Type aircraft resilience, pilot skill, or industrial production in the comments below, and your answers will shape future episodes. We value the community because your choices guide research, and we use your feedback to dive deeper into topics you care about. Now, back to the story, where we examine the larger operations that gave the Corsair a broad stage. The big demonstrations of the Corsair's power did not come in isolated dogfights, but in massed operations where numbers and logistics combined into strategic outcomes. One strike in late 1944 targeted an enemy airfield that fed fighters to contested islands. The operation synchronized naval bombardment, carrier fighter sweeps, and Corsair ground attack runs.
The objective was to kill runway capability and supplies. The mission brief listed 50 aircraft, 150 tons of ordnance, and a timeline with precision that suggested industrial times had met military doctrine. The Corsair squadrons strafed fuel depots, bombed repair sheds, and kept anti-aircraft positions suppressed long enough for follow-on forces to crater the runway. Post-mission analysis reported that sortie density reduced enemy sortie generation by 60% in the following weeks, and the cumulative effect was not just physical damage, but an erosion of the enemy's ability to contest sea lanes. Pilots returned with frames scorched with flak and grins split between exhaustion and the knowledge that they had done damage on a strategic scale. The psychological blow to the enemy was moot, as commanders noted in reports that the frequency and durability of Corsair presence changed how supply convoys moved, made night movements more common, and increased fuel convoy vulnerability. The demonstration proved a theory. Production's sustained presence and concentrated fire led to strategic mobility denial. Industry continued to be decisive as factories improved assembly time and logistics shortened re-equip cycles. New training schools sprang up to handle a growing pilot pool. Carrier deck crews got faster at handling the aircraft, and spare part logistics matured. The net result was that losses became manageable and units could maintain higher tempo operations. The scale was staggering. In human terms, thousands of workers moved metal and rivet by rivet, and each aircraft delivered altered the arithmetic of conflict. The enemy could not match this churn.
Began to prioritize defensive supply lanes over offensive actions, a change that shifted the balance. Commanders in the field observed not a single factor, but an integrated system of hardware, training, and production moving together like gears. In the end, the Corsair became more than a plane. It became a lesson in how industrial capacity and durable design can triumph where elegance cannot. The analysis is clear. Resilience and rate of production can outplay tactical finesse when sustained presence matters. And the Corsair taught commanders to measure success in sustained air coverage and attrition of enemy logistics, not in glamorous one-on-one triumphs. The epilogue in time reveals the full arc. 1 month later, units that had adopted the revised tactics reported a 20% increase in safe returns and a corresponding drop in pilot fatalities. Maintenance reports reflected fewer catastrophic failures because of improved part inventories and training notes. 1 month after the pivotal engagements, squadrons were regraded and began sending instructors to other theaters. 3 months later, the industrial effect accelerated. Spare parts stockpiles had reached critical mass, and carrier groups reported a 35% increase in sortie capacity. New tactical manuals were printed to include energy fighting doctrines, and the Japanese command began rerouting convoys to avoid concentrated areas of Corsair activity, causing delays that rippled through frontline supply chains. 3 months in, engineers at the main factory introduced incremental changes to cowling and throttle linkage informed by combat reports, which reduced engine overheating incidents by measurable rates. 6 months after the famed raids, the theater looked different. The enemy had fewer secure outposts and increased reliance on submarine escorts to preserve shipping lanes. The operational tempo of Allied air power had shifted from episodic raids to daily dominance, and statistical summaries showed a significant drop in enemy operational readiness in affected regions. The Corsair had matured from mocked newcomer to central piece of a theater-wide campaign. Final tallies in after-action archives cited hundreds of sorties, thousands of rounds expended, and the slow calcification of a new doctrine that privileged availability, concentrated fire, and industrial rhythm over momentary agility. In a later communique, an adversary commander acknowledged the misreadings and admitted that initial derision had been a mistake. The statement read, in a tone of grudging respect, "We did not take them seriously at first. We were wrong." The lasting lesson is both technical and human. The aircraft was not a miracle, but an outcome of persistent engineering, better training, and the mobilization of industrial resources and men like Calloway, who learned to live with danger and make exacting choices in the air. The final image is both literal and poetic.
The rust-red streaks of tracer and fire across Pacific dawn skies, the color of decisive change and of a theater that had been forced to adapt. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into how machines and men shaped battles and empires. Share your thought on
which detail surprised you most, and tell us whether you want to follow up on tactical adoption carrier operations or industrial logistics. Your comment helps shape the next episodes of this series. History remembers the Corsair, not for its looks, but for its persistence and its role in turning supply chains into targets and making the sky a tool of daily pressure. It taught navies and air forces that enduring presence, multiplied by numbers, could overwhelm the most graceful opposition, and that engineering choices have consequences that echo in tactics, training, and morale. The aircraft that was once ridiculed for its awkward profiles became the instrument of a campaign that painted the Pacific skies red with decisive action. And the last sentence belongs to a converted skeptic, a former adversary who confessed decades later. We laughed at first, but then we listened and we learned the hard way. If you want to hear more stories where technology met tenacity, subscribe and join the conversation.